In the standard version of industrial history, the story moves with clarity and direction. Human societies, we are told, struggled for centuries against the limits of muscle, wind, and water. Production was slow, output was constrained, growth was fragile. Then came the machine. Steam engines, spinning frames, blast furnaces, railways. Each invention built upon the last. Each solved a bottleneck. Each unlocked a new scale of possibility. Within this narrative, the coke oven appears as one more necessary step. A technical refinement. A hotter, cleaner-burning fuel made from coal. Coke enabled higher temperatures. Higher temperatures enabled stronger iron. Stronger iron enabled railroads, bridges, ships, skyscrapers. Industrial expansion becomes legible as a chain reaction. The logic feels linear. Museums often present this transformation as both dramatic and inevitable. Visitors walk through reconstructed furnace halls. They see glowing diagrams explaining how coal is heated in sealed chambers at nearly 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Volatile gases are driven off. What remains is carbon-rich coke. Efficient, powerful, essential. Panels describe how this process fueled steel production in Britain, Germany, and the United States. The implication is rarely stated outright, but it is clear. Without coke, there is no modern superpower. Textbooks follow a similar structure. Industrialization is organized around innovations. The steam engine improved mining. Coke improved smelting. Railways expanded markets. Productivity increased. Urban populations grew. Nations industrialized. The sequence appears rational and cumulative. In this telling, technology acts as the central agent. It propels society forward. Social change is treated as a consequence rather than a contested process. When labor conditions are mentioned, they are acknowledged but compressed. Long hours, harsh environments, eventually reformed. The arc bends toward improvement. The equation becomes intuitive. More efficient energy leads to more production. More production leads to prosperity. Prosperity leads to national strength. The coke oven, then, is framed not as a moral object, but as an engineering solution, a response to technical limitations in charcoal-based iron-making. Forests were depleted. Demand increased. Coke offered scalability. It appears as a neutral adaptation to economic pressure. This version of history is not overtly triumphant. It often uses restrained language, but it still rests on a foundational assumption. Technological progress is broadly aligned with social advancement. The machine may disrupt, but it ultimately improves. And yet, if this narrative is as stable as it seems, why do so many of its most intense sites, blast furnaces, coke batteries, steel mills, leave behind records that do not fit comfortably within that calm progression? When we look more closely at the rise of coke production, small inconsistencies begin to appear. The technical story emphasizes efficiency. Coke burned hotter than charcoal. It allowed larger blast furnaces. It reduced reliance on dwindling forests. Output increased. Costs stabilized. Steel became cheaper. Rail networks expanded. But the increase in furnace temperature did not translate into a proportional increase in human well-being. Early coke ovens were not sealed automated systems. They were long rows of narrow chambers, brick vaults packed with coal and fired from the outside or beneath. Workers charged coal into the ovens manually. They leveled it with rakes. They sealed the doors with clay. They monitored temperatures by sight and experience. When carbonization was complete, they opened the red-hot chamber and pushed out incandescent coke with long iron bars. The heat was not incidental. It was constant. Oven surfaces radiated extreme temperatures. Escaping gases, benzene, toluene, sulfur compounds, ammonia, filled the air. Fine coal dust settled into skin and lungs. Protective equipment was minimal or non-existent in the 19th century. Even in the early 20th, it remained rudimentary. Productivity statistics show steady increases in tonnage per worker. Steel output rose dramatically between 1870 and 1914 in the United States and Germany. The data is clear. But injury reports from industrial districts reveal another pattern. Burns, respiratory illness, eye damage, heat exhaustion. Mortality records in some steel towns show elevated rates of lung disease decades before formal recognition of occupational carcinogens. These details are not hidden. They appear in parliamentary investigations in Britain. They appear in U.S. Bureau of Labor reports. They appear in local newspapers during strikes. Yet in broader industrial histories, they are often summarized in a sentence or two. Working conditions were harsh. The phrasing compresses the experience into an expected phase of modernization. There is also a timing discrepancy. Textbooks often suggest that mechanization steadily reduced physical strain. But in coke production, the drive for larger batteries and higher throughput sometimes intensified labor demands. The scale of operations expanded faster than safety protocols. Mechanical charging systems and byproduct recovery ovens were introduced gradually, not immediately. For decades, manual labor remained central even as output soared. Another gap concerns geography. Industrial growth is usually mapped in terms of national progress. Britain industrialized, then Germany, then the United States. But coke ovens were frequently concentrated in specific regions. Pennsylvania's Monongahela Valley, the Ruhr in Germany, South Wales. These were not abstract spaces. They were densely populated working-class districts where smoke and chemical emissions were part of daily life. Environmental consequences were acknowledged early. Residents complained of blackened laundry, poisoned streams, acrid air. Farmers reported crop damage, yet regulatory responses were limited for long periods. Economic imperatives often outweighed local grievances. The contradiction is subtle but persistent. The same process that enabled national infrastructure also generated localized degradation. The national narrative highlights bridges and railroads. The regional memory includes coughing children and orange-stained rivers. There is also the question of dependency. Coke production required steady coal extraction. Mining accidents were common. Explosions, collapses, gas exposure. The industrial system functioned as an interlocking chain. The oven was only one node. But when histories focus on the finished steel beam, the upstream risks fade from view. None of this disproves the importance of coke. Without it, large-scale steel production would have been constrained. Rail networks might have expanded more slowly. Military shipbuilding would have faced limits. Industrial capacity mattered. Yet the equation higher temperature equals progress becomes less straightforward when the temperature was endured by human bodies. The official narrative treats suffering as transitional, a cost paid before reform. But reform often followed decades of agitation, strikes, and investigative journalism. It did not automatically arise from technical improvement. There is another quiet detail. Byproduct recovery ovens, introduced in the late 19th century, were praised for efficiency. They captured valuable chemicals from coal gas. This innovation increased profitability. It also reduced some visible pollution. But it did not eliminate exposure for workers handling tar, ammonia liquor, and other substances. Economic rationality and health protection overlapped only partially. The inconsistencies do not collapse the industrial story, they complicate it. Productivity rose. Nations strengthened. Urban skylines changed. At the same time, heat intensified, air thickened, bodies absorbed the cost. The textbooks rarely deny this. They simply move past it quickly, and the speed at which they move past it may be part of the story. The distortions in industrial history are rarely dramatic. They are structural. One of the most persistent distortions concerns the idea that machines liberated human labor. In popular accounts, mechanization reduces drudgery. Steam replaces muscle. Automation replaces repetition. Productivity gains create leisure, higher wages, and social mobility. The narrative arc bends toward emancipation, in the case of coke ovens and steel production. This liberation story becomes less stable when examined through contemporary records. Industrial promoters in the late 19th century frequently described mechanization as a civilizing force. Company pamphlets emphasized efficiency and modernity. Trade journals celebrated record outputs. Photographs showcased vast oven batteries glowing in orderly symmetry. The imagery suggested mastery over nature. But labor testimony tells a different story about the same sites. In U.S. Senate investigations into working conditions in steel districts during the early 20th century, coke oven workers described 12-hour shifts, sometimes rotating between day and night on a weekly basis. They described the shock of opening oven doors and facing a blast of superheated air. They described breathing fumes that made their eyes burn and their lungs ache. These were not rare anomalies. They were routine features of the job. Academic studies published decades later, analyzing mortality and occupational health data, found elevated risks of lung cancer among coke oven workers. Chemical byproducts such as benzene and polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons were eventually identified as carcinogenic. But recognition came long after widespread exposure. The liberation narrative does not deny hardship. It reframes it as transitional. Mechanization, the argument goes, initially intensifies labor, but eventually stabilizes and improves conditions. This framing compresses time. It suggests inevitability. Yet mechanization in heavy industry often restructured labor hierarchies rather than reducing strain. Skilled craftsmen lost autonomy as processes were standardized. Immigrant laborers were assigned to the most hazardous tasks. Wage differentials reflected ethnic and racial stratification in many industrial regions. The machine reorganized power inside the workplace. Popular histories tend to emphasize output curves. Steel production in the United States, for example, rose from a few million tons in the 1870s to tens of millions by the early 20th century. Graphs illustrate dramatic ascent. The implication is systemic success. But when one reads strike reports from places like Homestead in 1892, or accounts of labor unrest in the Ruhr, the image shifts. Industrial conflict was not peripheral. It was frequent and often violent. Wage cuts, speed-ups, blacklisting, private security forces. These episodes are acknowledged in political histories, yet they are often detached from technical histories of production. The furnace and the strike appear in separate chapters. This separation simplifies causality. Another distortion concerns the pace of mechanization. Retrospective accounts sometimes imply that once coke-based steelmaking was introduced, it rapidly displaced older methods and stabilized the industry. In reality, transitions were uneven. Charcoal iron persisted in some regions for decades. Open hearth furnaces coexisted with Bessemer converters. Technological pluralism was common. Investment decisions were influenced not only by efficiency, but by capital availability, labor costs, and local resource access. The image of a swift, linear transition from primitive to advanced obscures the contingent nature of adoption. There is also a rhetorical pattern in which human loss is normalized as a cost of development. Workplace fatalities in mining and steel were statistically significant, yet they are often framed as tragic but typical for the era. This phrasing subtly integrates harm into the definition of modernization. Comparing sources reveals the compression. Popular documentaries often highlight innovation milestones. The first successful use of coke in blast furnaces in 18th century Britain. The rapid expansion of steel production in Pittsburgh. The engineering feats of bridges and skyscrapers. They rely on clear sequences and identifiable breakthroughs. Contemporary newspapers, by contrast, frequently reported explosions, collapses, and health complaints. These reports did not interpret events as systemic flaws. They described immediate crises. But taken together, they reveal a pattern of recurring risk. Scholarly research adds another layer. Environmental historians have traced how coke ovens contributed to severe air pollution in industrial valleys. Soil contamination persisted long after plants closed. Cleanup costs were deferred for generations. Yet these long-term consequences rarely appear in the celebratory narratives of national industrial rise. The simplification serves practical functions. It makes industrial history teachable. A sequence of inventions is easier to organize than a web of social negotiations. It makes progress narratable. Heroes can be identified. Engineers, entrepreneurs, inventors. Systems of labor discipline are less easily personalized. It also aligns with broader cultural assumptions. Modern states often tie their legitimacy to economic growth. Industrial capacity becomes evidence of competence. Steel output becomes a metric of national strength. In this context, emphasizing the productive capacity of coke ovens reinforces narratives of emergence and power. The distortion is not necessarily intentional. It emerges from narrative convenience. A linear story is easier to remember than a contested one. But when liberation is assumed rather than examined, and when suffering is standardized rather than analyzed, the machine becomes abstracted from the conditions under which it operated. The coke oven at nearly 2,000 degrees was not only a technical instrument. It was a workplace. It was an environmental source. It was a site of conflict. It was embedded in financial systems and political decisions. When these dimensions are separated into distinct historical subfields, the core industrial narrative regains its smoothness. And smoothness may be the most powerful simplification of all. The political utility of industrial narratives becomes clearer when we examine how states presented heavy industry to their own populations. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, steel output was not simply an economic statistic. It was a symbol. Governments measured national strength in tonnage. International exhibitions displayed models of furnaces and rail systems as proof of modernity. Industrial districts were framed as evidence that a nation had entered the ranks of advanced powers. Within this symbolic framework, the coke oven was more than a furnace component. It was part of an infrastructure of legitimacy. Modernizing states often linked industrial capacity to civilizational status. Britain's early adoption of coke-based ironmaking was later narrated as a foundation of imperial power. Germany's Ruhr Valley became a centerpiece of national industrial identity. In the United States, Pittsburgh was labeled the Steel City, a shorthand for productivity and expansion. Steel underpinned railways, skyscrapers, naval fleets. The logic was clear. Industrial heat translated into geopolitical weight. This framing served administrative stability. If industrialization signified progress, then policies supporting heavy industry could be presented as rational and forward-looking. Subsidies, protective tariffs, land grants, and infrastructure investments were justified as necessary steps toward national advancement. The social costs within industrial regions were often treated as local problems rather than systemic contradictions. No conspiracy was required. The alignment between state interest and industrial expansion was structural. Military considerations intensified this alignment. Steel production capacity directly affected armament output. Railways determined troop mobility. Shipyards depended on reliable coke supplies. In times of conflict, industrial regions became strategic assets. Governments were therefore inclined to protect and promote the industries that secured national defense. Under these conditions, narratives emphasizing technological progress were stabilizing. They reduced political friction. If coke ovens were portrayed primarily as engines of prosperity and strength, questioning their social impact risked appearing unpatriotic or obstructive. There was also a symbolic dimension beyond military strategy. Modern states frequently associated technological mastery with cultural superiority. Industrial landscapes were interpreted as signs of discipline and organization. Smokestacks and furnace batteries appeared in paintings, postcards, and promotional materials. The harshness of the environment was reframed as evidence of vigor. This aestheticization did not deny hardship. It repositioned it as a form of collective endurance. Workers in extreme heat were depicted as contributors to national destiny. Their suffering was absorbed into a broader narrative of sacrifice for growth. Such representations made conflict less destabilizing. Labor unrest could be interpreted as temporary disruption within an otherwise coherent project of modernization. Calls for reform were acceptable so long as they did not challenge the legitimacy of industrial expansion itself. Economic interests further reinforced this structure. Industrial corporations were major taxpayers and employers. They influenced local governance and national policy through lobbying and investment decisions. States relied on industrial output for revenue and employment stability. This interdependence encouraged narratives that emphasized continuity rather than rupture. Environmental degradation posed a more complex challenge. Smoke, contaminated rivers, and toxic byproducts were difficult to integrate into a progress narrative. Early regulatory efforts were often limited or inconsistent. Acknowledging systemic pollution risked undermining the symbolic value of industrial districts. Therefore, environmental issues were frequently localized in discourse. Specific incidents were addressed. Individual plants were criticized. But the broader model of heavy industrial growth remained intact. The coke oven could be improved. Filters could be added. Efficiency could increase. The foundational equation, industrial heat equals advancement, remained largely unchallenged. The convenience of this narrative lies in its capacity to unify disparate interests. Industrialists gained legitimacy. Workers were positioned as participants in national growth. States consolidated authority through measurable output. Citizens could interpret urban transformation as evidence of collective achievement. The cost of this convenience was subtle. Structural tensions were softened. The uneven distribution of risk was rarely foregrounded in official accounts. Regions bearing concentrated environmental and health burdens were integrated into a national success story that did not fully represent their experience. This does not mean that states ignored suffering entirely. Labor laws were introduced. Safety regulations evolved. Public health initiatives expanded. But these reforms were often presented as refinements of an already valid system, not as critiques of its premises. The narrative of industrial progress proved politically resilient because it offered stability. It allowed modernization to appear coherent. It reduced ideological conflict. It connected economic output with national pride. In this environment, the coke oven's 2,000-degree interior could be interpreted as a necessary intensity rather than a question mark. And once that interpretation solidified, it shaped how subsequent generations understood the meaning of industrial power. There are records that do not sit comfortably inside the central narrative. They exist in labor archives, in technical appendices, in regional health studies. They are rarely secret. They are simply peripheral. Consider early 20th century labor reports from industrial valleys in Pennsylvania and South Wales. Inspectors documented not only wages and shift lengths, but also patterns of illness. Workers in coke batteries reported chronic coughing, skin lesions, eye inflammation. Some reports noted the accumulation of tar residues on clothing and exposed skin. These details were often presented in clinical language, without rhetorical emphasis. Yet they reveal a daily proximity to chemical exposure that standard industrial summaries rarely explore. Technical manuals for byproduct recovery ovens include precise instructions for handling coal tar, ammonia liquor, and benzol extraction. The language is procedural. It focuses on efficiency and containment. But embedded in these instructions are implicit acknowledgments of hazard. Ventilation systems are specified. Protective measures are recommended. The very need for these precautions indicates awareness of risk. Environmental surveys conducted in heavily industrialized districts during the mid-20th century show elevated concentrations of airborne particulates and contaminated waterways downstream from coke plants. Fish populations declined in certain rivers. Soil samples near oven batteries contained residues of polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons long after production ceased. These findings appear in environmental science journals and government assessments. They are not hidden, yet they are seldom integrated into broad accounts of national industrial ascent. There are also oral histories collected from former workers in interviews conducted decades after plant closures. Retired coke oven laborers describe the sensory environment, the metallic taste in the air, the constant grit in their teeth, the way heat radiated even in winter. They speak of pride in production targets met and of wages that supported families. But they also recall co-workers who developed lung disease in middle age. The testimonies are layered. They resist simple classification as either condemnation or celebration. Medical research from the 1960s and 1970s began to draw clearer correlations between coke oven emissions and cancer risk. Occupational health studies measured exposure levels at different positions along oven batteries. Topside workers faced higher concentrations of carcinogens than those assigned to other tasks. These findings contributed to regulatory standards in later decades. Yet by the time regulations tightened, generations had already worked under earlier conditions. Some regional histories document patterns of housing segregation near industrial sites. In certain districts, immigrant or minority communities were concentrated in areas closest to heavy industry. Proximity to coke plants meant cheaper land and shorter commutes, but also higher exposure to pollution. This spatial arrangement was shaped by economic constraints, not necessarily explicit design. Still, it structured risk distribution. Technical journals from the late 19th century occasionally include discussions about the trade-offs between open beehive coke ovens and newer byproduct recovery designs. Beehive ovens were simpler but released more pollutants. Recovery ovens captured valuable chemicals and reduced visible smoke. The transition between these systems was influenced by profitability calculations as much as environmental concerns. Efficiency and emission control overlapped unevenly. When these materials are placed alongside textbook summaries, the contrast is not one of contradiction, but of density. The mainstream narrative prioritizes macro-level indicators, output, innovation milestones, national growth. The peripheral documents emphasize lived conditions, localized impact, and incremental regulatory response. Neither set of records is fabricated. Both are real. The question is, which becomes central? Industrial history courses often have limited space. Instructors must choose representative examples. The coke oven may appear briefly as part of a broader explanation of steel production. Detailed occupational studies are assigned, if at all, in specialized seminars. The hierarchy of topics reinforces a hierarchy of significance. The cumulative effect is subtle. The technical achievement remains vivid. The social and environmental consequences appear episodic. Yet when read together, labor reports, technical manuals, environmental assessments, and oral histories suggest that the coke oven was not only an energy solution. It was an institutional arrangement that distributed heat, profit, illness, and power in patterned ways. These patterns do not overturn the industrial story. They complicate its proportions. The purpose of revisiting the coke oven is not to replace one grand narrative with another. It is not to claim that industrialization was a mistake, nor to deny the structural importance of high-temperature fuel in the rise of modern infrastructure. Steel mattered. Energy density mattered. States that mastered large-scale production gained measurable advantages. What becomes less stable is the assumption that the history of machines can be told as a neutral sequence of technical improvements. The coke oven operated at nearly 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. That heat transformed coal into a material capable of sustaining blast furnaces at unprecedented scales. It also transformed landscapes, labor routines, and regulatory frameworks. It tied mining regions to industrial cities. It linked corporate finance to military planning. It embedded chemical exposure into daily work. When the story centers primarily on output curves and engineering milestones, these embedded relationships recede into the background. One assumption that weakens under scrutiny is the idea that technological progress naturally aligns with social improvement. In practice, alignment required negotiation. It required labor agitation, public health research, environmental monitoring, and political compromise. Improvements in safety and emission control were not automatic byproducts of higher efficiency. They were often responses to documented harm. Another assumption concerns inevitability. Industrial narratives frequently imply that once a superior technology becomes available, adoption follows logically. But the shift from charcoal to coke, from beehive ovens to byproduct recovery systems, unfolded unevenly. Capital constraints, local labor markets, regulatory pressures, and geopolitical strategy influenced timing. The path was not singular. There is also the question of scale. National strength measured in steel tonnage can obscure the fact that industrial intensity was geographically concentrated. The benefits of infrastructure expansion were distributed widely. The environmental and health burdens were not always shared proportionally. This imbalance does not negate the broader gains. It complicates their evaluation. None of these observations produce a final verdict. They do not prove that the industrial narrative is false. They suggest that it is incomplete. The coke oven can be understood simultaneously as an engineering innovation, a workplace hazard, an environmental source, a symbol of national ambition, and a node in global economic competition. Reducing it to one dimension simplifies comprehension. It also narrows interpretation. The stability of the conventional story may derive less from its factual accuracy than from its coherence. A linear progression from scarcity to abundance, from low temperature to high, from local production to global power, provides conceptual order. But coherence is not the same as completeness. If machines are embedded in social systems rather than standing outside them, then the history of those machines cannot be separated from the distribution of risk, profit, and authority that accompanied them. The coke oven's intense heat fueled railways and warships. It also illuminated the limits of describing industrialization as a neutral ascent. The question that remains is not whether industrial progress occurred. It is whether we have fully examined the framework that taught us what progress was supposed to mean.